next time. Okay, so let me wait a bit here to see if more people connect, and then we can start. Give me 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, so we're going, what did I say? Is Jim first? And then it's Jose, is it right? Or it's Simon?
On the schedule, it said first Jim, then Jose, then me.
Okay. Should I say Simon or Simon?
Either way works. Simon
Okay.
is fine. It's
Simon,
easier
okay.
for everyone, I guess.
But you're from Switzerland, right?
From Belgium.
Oh, you're from Belgium. Oh, so it's Simon. Okay, so it's French. No,
it's actually Dutch. My pronunciation. Sorry for making things complicated. That's why I just preferred English.
Simon. Okay, it's fair enough.
Sorry.
Okay, give me 1 more minute, Jim. So just to see if more people come. All right, so why don't we get started? I'm very happy to be organizing this session on trade and labor markets. So this is a session that is going to be focusing on structural models to understand the effect of trade, globalization, and automation on labor markets. We are first getting Jim Tybalt speaking, then Jose Vasquez, Simon Geil, and then I'll finish the session. And yeah. I'm very excited to see, these very high profile papers in the next hour or so. All yours, Jim. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Raphael, for putting this session together. I'm really interested to see how it unfolds too. I'm presenting a paper which is joint with Nezzy Gunnar and Alessandro Ruggieri. I don't even know what Nezzy's acronyms mean anymore, except for University of Barcelona. They were just updated. But anyway, this is a paper that's motivated by some well-known developments in the U.S. labor market post-1980. As I think most people know, the skill premiums have been growing. The fraction of the population attending college has grown. The jobs in the middle of the skill distribution have become relatively scarce, and that's going to be critical for us. Manufacturing workforce has shifted towards services. Job turnover rates have come down, and on-the-job training times have increased. So what we want to do is link these things back to their driving forces, and we're going to distinguish 3 types. Globalization forces, by which I mean reductions in tariffs and transport costs. Changing abilities abroad, by which I mean changes that take the form of factor augmenting technological progress. And then finally, automation and new task creation, by which I mean the displacement of jobs by machines. Now, this isn't a new game, but what we're going to do is try to play it in a new way. We're going to try to link these causal forces back to labor market outcomes by taking what I'll call a career path approach, which is to say, we'll try to link these shocks to the sequence of jobs and unemployment spells that workers experience over a working lifetime, allowing for worker heterogeneity and different types of paths. And we'll also ask how that translates into path-specific earnings trajectories. So here's the basic idea. Suppose shocks of some kind reduce the jobs in the middle of the job ladder, the mid-skill jobs. But once that happens, that means if you're below those jobs on the ladder, the arrival rate for jobs that you view as better is going to slow down. And that means even though you're qualified to move up the ladder, it may be a while before you can do so. You'll be stuck there waiting. And if a shock happens to your employer, then you're going to be likely to move into unemployment rather than to a better job, at which point you lose bargaining power, your training is interrupted if your employer was training you, and your acquisition of experience will also be interrupted. Looking up from the perspective of somebody entering the labor market, looking up at the job ladder, that person's going to see that these rungs are missing, or not completely missing, but it's hard to traverse them. And so that will create for these new entrants an incentive to try to leapfrog those missing rungs by getting a college education rather than coming up through the ranks at a firm. So one feature of the model is going to be that more people go to college, and since workers are heterogeneous, the ones who select into college are going to be less qualified at the margin. The other thing that's going to happen in the model is that as people get shuffled among different jobs, those without college degrees are going to get or land with more frequency in jobs where the return to on-the-job training is lower, and that'll slow down their advancement and flatten out their life cycle earnings profile. So there's a ton of literature out there, and if I clicked on that button, then that would be my 20 minutes. So I've just listed a single reference for each of these, and looking at today's session, I think I should have included Simon's paper as one of the most relevant papers, because it both looks at automation and general equilibrium, and asked how labor markets are affected by globalization instead of versus technological change. Anyway, if you download the paper, you can find more discussion of the literature. Now, before I get into the model, I want to I meant to have my clock going and I failed. I want to briefly recap the micro features of the labor market that we're trying to capture. And I'll do this using mainly the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which is a large nationally representative household survey. It's a series of overlapping panels. But I'll also be using a little bit the ONET database, which tells us about the task requirements of different types of jobs. Using principal components, we can summarize task requirements in terms of how much brain they require and how much brawn they require. So we're going to use a brain index to sort jobs in the graphs I'm about to show you. The brawn index is basically a negative monotonic function of the brain index. So you could equally well think of this as the inverse of brawn, if you prefer that. Later on, I'll be using a third data set just to get patterns of employment by different occupations in different industries, but I'm not going to get to that just yet. Anyway, here's a graph in which every dot corresponds to a particular two-digit occupation. And in this graph, the dots are telling us how job-to-job training rate, job-to-job transition rates have changed between the period 1990 and 2010. Now, jobs are distinguished in terms of their brain skill content from low to high. So the low end of the brain skill distribution is here and the high end here. And the point of this graph is that jobs with relatively little brain skill content have seen their job-to-job transition rates dropping over this 20-year period, whereas that hasn't happened at the high end of the skill distribution. And it doesn't matter whether we put brain skill content or wage or percentage of the people in these occupations going to college, the graph looks almost identical. And we could go to 4-digit occupation instead of 2-digit, it would still look identical. So that's a really robust pattern. Now, this one is about transitions, not job to job, but transitions job to unemployment or non-employment, I should say more accurately. And here, the trend between those 2 years has been upward. In other words, when people are more likely to transit into non-employment than they were 20 years ago, and that's especially true at the low end of the skill distribution. So this is looking only at well, sorry, these are rates, so it's 1% or 2%. So it's looking at the probability that this particular occupation transits into unemployment is 1%. Okay, so that's a second pattern, which we want our model to capture. A third one is changes in training rates. And here you can see those have been going up at the high end of the skill distribution, but not at the low end of the skill distribution. In fact, the lowest end, they seem to be going down a little. Now, these graphs tell us about workers moving up the job ladder more explicitly. They're telling us the probability that you move to a higher brain skill content job and the probability you move to a lower brain skill content job. This first one here is the probability of dropping down the ladder, and it's the change in probability dropping down between 2010 and 1990. You can see if you're in one of the higher brain skill distributions, you're less likely to be dropping down the ladder now than you were 20 years ago. But if that's not true, if we go back here, of course, the last dot has to be no change because it's impossible to drop off the bottom rung of the job ladder. This one is telling us the probability of moving up the ladder, more accurately, how that's changed in the last 20 years. And the probability of moving up has dropped pretty dramatically here among the low end of, among the low skill jobs. There's been no drop in the mid to upper skill jobs. So if you're down here, it's become more difficult to move up the ladder, and you're at least as likely to be dropping down the ladder. Finally, these are changes in wages over the from when you're 22-year-old up to 42-year-old, every dot corresponding to an occupation. The red dots are 1990, the blue dots are 2010. And the message of this paper is rates of growth in wages over the life cycle have dropped a little bit at the low end, and they've come up some at the high end. Okay, so we're going to build a model which captures all these things and then use it for some counterfactuals. The model is going to have random search, including on-the-job search, and it'll also have visibility effects, which is to say you'll be more likely to be visible to employers who are looking to hire somebody in an occupation similar to yours, based on the brain and bronze skill content of your job. The model is going to have endogenous ability acquisition, not just through your initial investment in college education, if you choose to do that, but also through on-the-job experience and training. And then finally, we're going to place this economy in a global equilibrium based on Caliendo and Paro's well-known paper. We're going to fit the model to the data, first calibrating the Caliendo-Paro parameters in a fairly standard way. And then we'll get the automation effects the way Acemoglu and Restrepo do, just with by assuming Cobb-Douglas and changes in the Cobb-Douglas parameters will tell us how much capital is displacing labor. And then finally, the remaining parameters we'll get by calibrating to a large set of moments. Once we've got the model fit, then we'll use exact hat algebra to isolate the effects of globalization, foreign capabilities, and automation. Now, the model has three types of agents, I should say. My phone keeps going to sleep here. The first type of agent is worker consumers. These are heterogeneous in terms of their initial abilities, and their abilities are evolved through time. I'll say more about that in a minute. The second type of agent is an occupational service producer. Now, each occupational service producer specializes in producing a particular type of service. Maybe it's secretarial service or assembly service or legal services or delivery, whatever it is. Every producer specializes in one of those things and then hires her workers in a frictional labor market. Once she's hired a worker, they check whether the surplus created by that match is positive. If it is, they go ahead and produce. If not, then they both go back to searching. And then finally, the occupational service producers turn around and sell these occupational services to goods producers in competitive markets. So it's a little bit artificial, maybe more than a little, because we've with this mechanism divorced the people who do the hiring from the people who use the service. And that's just because if we had firms hiring lots of different types of occupations and then turning around and producing, it would be an impossibly complicated problem to solve, because we're going to have bargaining over the rents associated with the match. And if we had large employers hiring lots of different types of workers, you have to keep track of all the different types of workers and the probabilities that we're going to separate. So that's just a device to simplify things. The final type of agent is going to be goods producers, and these combine these bundles of occupational services that they buy from the service producers with bundles of intermediates and with capital in order to produce output. We need the capital in the model if we want to have the Restrepo Acemoglu type mechanism at play. We're going to use sector specific, each producer uses a sector specific technology and then participates in a Galeano Paro world economy. Okay, so let me get more specific about the worker consumers. Each one is born with an initial ability, call it A0, like draw from some exogenous distribution. And at that point, she decides, do I want to get a college education or not? The cost of a college education for the worker is going to be kappa over A0. So the higher your initial ability, the more appealing is college is to you. If you choose not to go to college, you're a low skill worker. If you choose to go to college, you become a high skill worker. Now, that's not the end of the story in terms of your ability, because your abilities are going to stochastically improve over time as you move through a finite ordered set. And the hazard that you're going to move up one rung depends upon two things. First, there's this parameter gamma, and that depends upon your education level, whether you're high or low skilled. It also depends upon whether there's a second parameter, which makes your hazard of moving up depend upon whether you're receiving training or not. So this is just an indicator function, which tells us whether your employer finds it in her interest to send you to training or not. And the employer will just do that whenever the surplus of the match is increased by endowing the worker with training, since the bargaining is going to result in them splitting the surplus. Okay, so that's workers. The service producing firms are, as I said, going to be particular to a particular service, and that service be indexed by J. When they're first created, they need to hire a worker, so there's a flow vacancy posting cost. They'll go to the frictional labor market and try to match with workers, and then check whether the match creates a surplus or not. Once they've hired a worker, then if they want to train her, that's going to create a flow cost C super T. They're also going to be subject to idiosyncratic productivity shocks. These are just a Markov process, and they given all that, their output is determined by this function here. So Z is their productivity shock. S is just a scalar, which is for that particular occupation. That's the ability of the worker. And this tells us how much the output increases with ability. So some sectors ability will be important, others not. Now, that's reinforced by these last two terms, which penalize employers for hiring an underqualified worker and even penalize them for hiring an overqualified worker. But kappa and iota are going to be parameters to be estimated. So these things may or may not turn out to be important. C super 0 is just the ongoing fixed cost of operating a service producing firm. Okay, what about goods producers? These guys are pretty standard. They're going to just use a Cobb-Douglas technology to combine intermediate inputs. These are, each X is a bundle of intermediate inputs from a particular sector. They'll combine those things with primary inputs, and the primary inputs are themselves a Cobb-Douglas function of the different occupations that are used in sector K, each with its own sector-specific exponent, as well as the capital, which is used in sector K. Now we're going to limit our attention to steady states. So spending on capital is just going to amount to replacing depreciating capital, as well as compensating the owners of the capital stock at some fixed interest rate. So this is going to 5. Really? Okay. This is going to enter the technology here, along with a standard Frichet productivity shock. All right, so I'm going to skip some stuff. And I'm going to show you a preliminary calibration of this model, which is based on data from 2005 to 2008, 30 industries and 12 occupations. It's hard to get a large number of occupations in there because we're solving a dynamic problem for each occupation. I say it's preliminary because we haven't really completely dealt in a satisfactory with the automation, and we need to adjust the Francine productivity shifters for the automation effects. We haven't done that yet, and we need to deal with how big the gains from automation are. There's a parameter in there that we haven't really pinned down yet. Also, we're not using an efficient weighting matrix in the calibration yet. But anyway, just to give you a sense, when we get the T's out, most of the action is going to come from changes in the China Francine productivity shifter. That's jumping a lot. So that's the big thing going on there in terms of foreign capabilities. I will skip the calibration. The other thing, and as I said, we're not quite ready to talk about final results on the automation. So what I'm going to do here is, remember these mu's and the exponents back here for the different occupations. I'm just going to say, suppose we shock those mu's in a way which reduces the values of the mid-scale occupations to producers, but still keeps them summing to 1. That's all that's going on here. So if I average them across sectors, this is what the counterfactual experiment's going to do in terms of changes. It's going to pull down the ones in the middle of the skill distribution, but to keep them summing to 1, the ones at the end have to come up a bit. All right, so here's what happens in terms of the automation shock to employment to non-employment transitions. Those are going to drop, but they're going to drop more for, well, I should say, got it, thanks. They're going to drop for the college educated workers. So they're going to be less likely to go into unemployment, but they're going to go up for the non-college educated workers. Likewise, for the job to job transition rates, we're going to see those go up for the college educated workers, down for the non-college educated workers. And remember, I didn't shock anything having to do with dynamics. I just changed the relative frequency with which, well, I changed the prevalence of these mid-skill occupations, and that's showing up in the transition paths. People going to college is going to go up 4%. Training shares are going to go up, especially for people with college educated, and income inequality is going to go up as well. This is just the growth in the average wages. Again, brain content on the horizontal axis here, mainly negative, below average brain content, and positive above. Changes in the college shares, no change here, but notice these are the guys in the mid-skill distributions who didn't necessarily used to need to get a college education. Now they're getting it. And changes in trained shares, there's really no strong pattern there. So just to finish up, I'm embarrassed I still don't have results, final results in this. Raphael saw me present this, what, 3 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, and it's still preliminary, but it's closer. So we need to clean things up and do some policy experiments. We're thinking about commercial policy experiments, education subsidies, training subsidies, and improvements in the matching technology. Also, it's conceivable you could look at transition dynamics in the model, but that's ambitious given how many moving parts it's got. And we'd be interested in applying this to some other countries where the shocks have taken a different form, and see how well it predicts changes in their labor market outcomes as well. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jim. Very ambitious paper. I mean, many moving parts, yeah, but still very impressive. I think Jose now is up next.
Let me share my screen.
Thank you.
So are you able to see my screen? Okay. Well, thank you, Raphael, for organizing this session, a very interesting session, and for including our paper in it. So the motivation of this paper starts with the main findings of the very influential paper of author Don and Hanson, 2013, where they find that commuting zones that are more exposed to the increasing import competition from China between 2000 and 2007 experience important labor market effects. So let me focus on the 2 regression coefficients that are in the red square here. The first one tells us that a $1,000 per worker increase in import exposure to China increases the unemployment to population rate by 0.22 percentage points. The second one says that the same rise in import exposure increases the labor force non-participation to population rate by 0.55 percentage points. These are, of course, difference in difference regressions, where the results identify relative effects between local labor markets with differential levels of import exposure. And of course, the results do not identify any aggregate level or any general equilibrium effects. But still, the existence and the magnitude of these effects are hard to square with the predictions from the standard trade models that we use to quantify the welfare effects of things like the China shock. And in particular, models that do not feature unemployment effects could give us an incomplete picture of the overall effects of the trade shock, because these unemployment effects are a central finding in the empirical literature studying this kind of shocks. So our objective in this paper is to present a model that allows us to quantify the aggregate effects of trade shocks and at the same time to be consistent with empirical facts. So how can we rationalize the effects that I showed you in the previous slide? One can start from the standard gravity model with multiple regions, sectors, and input-output loop, like the Caliendo-Amparo 2015 that Jim mentioned before. One can easily accommodate the changes in unemployment by just adding an upward sloping supply curve and interpreting all the involuntary unemployment together with the non-participation as just people engaging in home production. So this is the fix that most of the papers in the literature have studied to match the non-employment effects, or the employment effects, better said. So, but in this case, if the wage goes down, then people just go home and they move along the supply curve. One limitation of this approach is that if we want to match the large changes in employment that we observed from the China shock, then we will need to have an unreasonably large labor supply elasticity. And another issue is that we won't be able to talk about involuntary unemployment. Of course, and this has implications, because if the shock makes people just go home and to engage in home production, then it basically, home production serves as smoothing the shock. But if the shock makes people who want to work at the market wage to remain unemployed, then the welfare consequences could be very different. And to deal with this issue, we propose a model with downward nominal wage rigidity as a mechanism to deliver on involuntary unemployment. And then armed with the model, we will calibrate the model to match the regression coefficients that I showed you in the table before. And with this, we will be able to study the effects of the China shock, and in particular, how the welfare changes with and without downward nominal wage rigidity. So we start from the standard gravity model of trade of the Caliendo-Amparo, and we extend this model to allow for multiple periods. To that model, we first add the discrete choice problem, where workers engage in home production or participate in the labor market. And this will introduce a parameter kappa, which is the elasticity of substitution between home production and work. We're now currently working on a revised model where we start from the fully dynamic Caliendo working Amparo paper with forward-looking agents. And we're very close to have the first set of results for that model, but for now, I will just present what we currently have. And to this model that I'm describing, we will add downward nominal wage rigidity, as in the paper of Smith, Grohe, and Uribe, which studied the effects of the reversal of capital flows and economic activities. And this wage rigidity that we introduce will add a second parameter, delta, which will govern how rigid the wages are. And the exact implications of the downward nominal wage rigidity will depend on our assumptions regarding the monetary policy or the exchange rate system, but the results are broadly robust to a set of different assumptions. So we want to quantify the effects of the China shock in our model, and we will conduct counterfactual analysis using the standard Had algebra approach. For this, we will need data at the sector level of trade flows and input-output system. For countries, we will just take this from the WIOTs, and we extend this data set to allow to include as regions the 50 US states. And as it is common in this literature, we will treat the China shock as an increase in productivity in China that varies across sectors. And we will calibrate these sector level productivity shocks so that the model implied changes in imports from China to the US will match those that we observe in the data. We then will calibrate the two parameters, the important parameters in the model, kappa and delta, so that the effects of the exposure of the China shock on unemployment and labor force participation that the model delivers will match these two well-identified coefficients from the ADH paper that I showed you in the red square in the first table. And finally, we just see what happens to the welfare. So in terms of the findings, what we have is that the downward nominal wage rigidity will have important implications, quantitative and qualitative implications when we think about welfare from the China shock. Without the nominal rigidity, the China shock is a positive terms of trade shock for most of the states because they use intensively inputs that are produced in sectors in which China experienced a productivity shock. And in this case, only 3 states suffer from declines in employment and welfare. And of course, in this version of the model, without downward nominal wage rigidity, there is no unemployment, and so we don't talk about that. But most of the states gain from the shock. However, when we add downward nominal wage rigidity, there are 13 states that experience a welfare loss, and 41 states that experience declines in employment and increases in unemployment during the transition. 10 out of these 13 states, they experience losses, even if the China shock is a positive terms of trade shock for these states. And for us, this is the most important qualitative insight of our paper. So even states for which the China shock is a positive terms of trade shock could experience welfare losses. So in this case, the downward nominal wage rigidity is not only a mechanism to amplify the effects of the terms of trade shock, but it could also have opposite effects. So a positive terms of trade shock, for example, that requires a large enough nominal wage adjustment, nominal decline in the wage, will hit the downward nominal wage rigidity and will generate unemployment. And so it could be that something that is supposed to be good, the positive terms of trade shock, could end up being bad in the world with this rigidity. At the level of the US, we see a 0.8 percentage point increase in unemployment and a 1.1 percentage point reduction in the labor force participation between 2000 and 2004, which is the year of the peak of the China shock. And as a whole, in terms of welfare, the China shock is still beneficial, but in the presence of rigidities, the gains from the China shock are reduced between 1/3 and 2/3 when we have downward nominal wage rigidity. Because of the time, I will just skip the literature review and let's just discuss the model and the basic assumptions. So we have I regions, which are M regions in the US and I-M countries outside of the US. Here we have S sectors and B broad sectors. Sectors are industries that belong to the broad sector. So a broad sector, let's say, is manufacturing, and non-manufacturing is another broad sector. And the sectors S would be industries within these 2 broad sectors. In the baseline model, we don't have mobility of labor across regions, and we assume perfect mobility across the sectors, but this is something that we change in the extensions. We have a Cobb-Douglas preferences across sectors, and within each sector, there is an Armington assumption. So in each sector, there is a CES in order to aggregate consumption of the variety by each of the I regions. Each sector also has and region also has a Cobb-Douglas production function that uses labor and intermediate inputs under perfect competition. And we assume that these intermediates are also coming from different origins with the same Armington assumption. So the preferences and technologies that we have will give rise to these, the following price indices that we have in the slides. And this will give us the standard gravity structure of trade, which is common in quantitative trade models. So now talking about home production, we will include an outward sloping labor supply curve in our model, which would be given because of the home production. So agents can engage in home production or could look for work in the labor market. If they engage in home production, they will receive a constant utility flow. And if they participate in the labor market, they will be employed by any of the broad sectors. On top of that, agents can have idiosyncratic preference shocks, not only between home production and work, but also productivity draws for the broad sectors, which will come from a nested extreme value distribution. So the labor supply in a particular sector B would be the product of the total number of workers in that region times the labor force participation times the share of workers who ultimately decide to work for that broad sector B. In the absence of nominal rigidities, there wouldn't be any unemployment, and the expected wage would be, real wage would be equals to just W over P. But with downward nominal wage rigidities, then this expected real wage will be composed by two parts. The first one would be the real wage that workers get if they work, and this will be multiplied times the probability of employment. So when people decide to take a job or to look for a job in a sector, they have to take into account what is the real wage that they might get, but also the probability that they won't get a job. So in terms of the nominal rigidity, we will focus on local currency units first. The nominal rigidity in local currency units at a given sector and a given point in time, it says that the nominal wage cannot be smaller in period t minus 1 than delta times the nominal wage in period t. So this means that the nominal wage can fall at most 100 times 1 minus delta % each period. And this will give us a complementary slackness condition, which could imply that it could be the possibility that the labor market doesn't clear. But then we need to bring everything back to dollars. So before it was defining local currency units. And when we do this, we need to take a stand on what is the exchange rate for other countries. In our paper, we have two polar options. The first one is one in which there's full flexibility. So in other third countries outside of the US and China, so other countries won't have any unemployment because they can always depreciate. There's the other polar option in which they have fixed exchange rate, in which case the nominal wage rigidity in other countries is the same as the one in the US, because it would be all in dollars. And those countries could also experience the burden of unemployment and share it with the US. And in the end, both of these assumptions, they deliver similar results. So it doesn't seem to be the exchange rate that important. Now let me talk about the nominal anchor. So we will capture the nominal forces in our model in a rather simplistic way. What we will assume is that the world nominal GDP in dollars grows at a constant rate gamma across time. And this is going to be in dollars. So this is why the US cannot depreciate against the nominal anchor, because it's also in dollars. Here in this equation on the left, we have the world nominal GDP at the time t. And on the right, we have the world nominal GDP of the previous period. And this is times a gamma. So in the end, what matters is the gap between gamma and delta in a model, because even if you have a lot of downward nominal wage rigidity, then if you have a very high gamma and there is high inflation, then all nominal quantities could go up, and then the downward nominal wage rigidity won't be ever binding. So in order to deal with this, we will follow Schmidt, Grohe, and Uribe, and we will normalize the value of gamma equal to 1. So all the burden of the adjustment will be on the delta. So when I give the results of the delta, just have in mind that this is for a world in which gamma equals to 1. So the results are relative to gamma, which is the growth in world nominal GDP. So now in order to, when we put all the pieces of the model, we quantify the effects of the China shock using a hat algebra approach to counterfactual analysis. And we will match the data in 2000, which is our first period, and then we will roll the shock forward and see what happens. So in terms of the data, we will use trade and production data for the 50 US states, and we will have 36 additional countries and an aggregate rest of the world. So there are 87 regions, and we will be studying it for 2000 to 2007, which is the period of study of ADH. We will have 14 sectors, 12 of them in manufacturing, 1 services, and 1 agricultural sectors. And there's a lot of detail in terms of the data construction. So I will just refer you to the paper, but we basically extend the construct of an input-output and bilateral trade flows between regions and sectors, including the US, having each state as a separate region. So I think that's a data set that will be left there and is interesting for future use. In terms of the exposure to China, we will define the China shock, the exposure to the China shock with a measure that is analogous to the one of ADH. So here we'll have a Bartek type measure that has the importance of the sector in the economy times the predicted increase of imports from China. And as in ADH, this predicted increase is the projected one on the changes in imports from China to other high income countries. So in terms of the calibration of the China shock, we will calibrate the change in the productivity such that in the simulations of the model will match the US imports in manufacturing from sectors in China. We will decompose the total productivity shock in a sector S at time t into a component coming from the productivity increase over time that is constant across sectors, and another component which is the sector level productivity increase in each period. And we pick these productivity changes so that they match the total imports per sector in the US from China between 2000 and 2007, and also the yearly change in aggregate imports in the US from China. In terms of the parameters, we will just select a trade elasticity equal to 5 in all sectors. As I mentioned earlier, we will set the rate of growth in the nominal GDP in dollars equal to 1. So all the burden of the nominal adjustment would be on the delta. In the baseline model, we will assume one broad sector. So this is equivalent to say that there is perfect mobility across all sectors. And we will calibrate the main parameters, delta and kappa, so that the model matches the effect of exposure to the China shock on unemployment and participation from the main specification in the paper of author Don and Hanson. This calibration results in a delta equals to 0.984, which means that the wages cannot fall in nominal terms more than 1.6% per year, which is a reasonable value. And we have additional reassurance that Smith, Grohe, and Uribe find a very similar value using a totally different approach. No, it's not a calibration in the model. And they're not calibrating in particular the moments that we want to target. And we also find a value of kappa equals almost to 6, which together with the 2/3 of the labor force participation implies a labor supply elasticity of around 2, which is on the high side given the empirical estimates in the labor literature, but it's still not unreasonable, in particular if you compare to recent macro papers. Okay, let me just, in the last 5 minutes, show you very quickly some of the results. Let's start with the average employment. So we start from 0 change by assumption, and this is where the shock hits, and the shock starts hitting and employment decreases in most of the years in which the shock hits, in which the import competition is the highest. And at the end, employment is higher in the long run because 2 things. First, in our simulation calibration, the China shock stops in 2007. So there are no more shocks after that. Second, it's not only that the shock stops, but the real wages overall tend up to be higher because it's a positive terms of trade shock in the long run. So this encourages participation. And we could see this when we looked at the results in participation. On impact, the shock leads to temporarily declining participation, in part stemming from the fact that unemployment discourages participation because now the workers, they go to the labor market and if they don't find something, then they remain unemployed. And this is a risk that they take into account, so participation decreases. But then once the shock stops and the economy adjusts, then the labor force participation ends up being larger. And we would see that in the case of unemployment, we see a reverse path. It's increasing at the beginning, but then it falls to 0. So the nature of the unemployment in our paper is temporary because as the economy adjusts, the nominal quantities could adjust up to 2% per year, such that in the long run, there's no unemployment. And then this gives us some utility paths in the case of without nominal wage rigidities, which are the first 2 lines, and with the downward nominal wage rigidities. So when we talk about welfare, here's the sum of the utility flows over time. So it would be important which discount factor we use. If we use 0.95, which is the common one, we have that in the case without rigidity, the China shock has a welfare effect of a welfare gain of 0.32%. But then this is reduced to 0.21% once we introduce the rigidities. And of course, this will depend on what is the discount factor that we use. So here, I would just say it very quickly, just to summarize what I said at the beginning. There are 10 states for which they lose in terms of welfare from the China shock, even if the China shock is a positive terms of trade shock for these states. And this happens because they experience unemployment during the transition. So even if in the long run, they might have the full effects of the positive terms of trade shock, during the transition, there is a lot of unemployment, and this is what is hurting them in terms of welfare overall. In terms of job losses, the naive estimate would be to assume that there is zero effect on the places that have zero exposure. So it's kind of the naive ADH calculation. But once we take into account all the GE effects, in our model, we find that the China shock has an effect in decreasing jobs by around 1.28 million. We have several extensions. I want you to look at the paper. Just the main message of the paper is kept. Of course, the more rigidities and frictions we add, the welfare gains are even lower compared to the case without rigidities, but the main intuitions remain. And just to conclude, we have a model in which the downward nominal wage rigidity could explain the increasing unemployment and the increasing non-labor force participation from the empirical evidences to studying the shock. And it has important implications for welfare. And in the overall, the welfare gains are between 1/3 and 2/3 smaller with the nominal rigidities compared to in the world without rigidities. And of course, we have some mechanical, simple macro rule that that drives the growth in the nominal GDP. And this is our nominal anchor. But in the end, of course, the state-of-the-art macro paper have a more complicated monetary rule, but still with the simple rule that we have, we're able to capture well what is going on and to match the empirical evidence. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose. Very nice paper, including unemployment into the CDP framework and enriching our understanding of the China shock. Great stuff. So I put some questions here for you and Jim, and as well, Simon has questions as well. And for the audience, please feel free to use the chat and communicate with us through the chat. But now we should have Simon. Yeah. Thank you, Simon. You're mute, Simon.
Okay, does this work for you? The screen is fine. Okay, thanks. So thank you very much for having me on this session. So it's really a honor to be together with all these great papers. So I'm going to talk about the unequal effects of trade and automation across local labor markets, and this is joint work with Linnea Lorentzen. The basic motivation for the paper comes from this map here, where we see dramatic inequality in economic performance across commuting zones in the United States for the period 2000 to 2007. So to be more precise, what you see is the percent change in labor income per worker by commuting zone. And you see here, for instance, in the Rust Belt, that there's sort of strong declines in that measure. So dramatic inequality across US local labor markets in this period. And simultaneously, there's also the surprisingly swift decline in manufacturing employment, which falls by 20.5% or 3.5 million jobs. And so what explains this pattern? Well, as you might expect, both trade and technology likely contributed to this pattern. So there's been, as you all know, a surge in import competition from China during this period. But at the same time, we notice that manufacturing employment falls while manufacturing value added continues to grow. And that's sort of indicative that there's something else going on, that, for instance, automation might be playing a part as well. And so what we are going to do is to present a unifying framework to examine the joint impact of trade and automation, both at the macro level and across local labor markets. So now let me present the central ingredients of the paper. And so the central ingredients are basically a simple supply and demand graph, but at the sector specific level. So we have sector-specific labor supply, where workers are imperfectly mobile across sectors. And so that's our Roy Fréchet setup. And then we're also going to have sector-specific labor demand, which is coming from a multi-sector gravity model of trade. And that's going to ensure that labor demand at the sector level is downward sloping in the sector's wage. Then there are going to be two types of shocks. So there's going to be an increase in equipment efficiency or automation, or an increase in foreign productivity or import competition. And so both of these shocks can shift sectors' labor demand down, as you see on the graph here. And so the consequence is going to be that commuting zones that are more specialized in sectors with a contracting labor demand are then going to experience a relative decline in income, and that's going to be amplified by a relative increase in frictional unemployment and the reduction in hours worked. Both shocks also reduce prices. And so in addition to the distributional effects that we summarized on the previous bullet point, there's also going to be aggregate consumer gains arising from these price reductions. So that's sort of the paper in a nutshell. So contribution to the literature. So first, I should say that perhaps Jim's paper is quite closely related, and I should update my introduction to reflect that. But to start, this paper is certainly motivated by the reduced formwork on the impact of trade or technical change across local labor markets, in particular the Arthur Dorn and Hansen work. And so what we then bring to the table is a unifying G framework that's going to introduce automation in a gravity model of trade with a Roy Fréchet labor supply side. And so what's new here relative to my previous work with Andres and Moises is really the automation part that we're adding to this framework. From the point of view of models of technical change, well, many of these models focus on the skill premium, for instance, and so our focus is going to be different. We are going to focus on distributional effects that arise from a specific factors mechanism. So that's our contribution there. So we think we have a contribution. The model also has some limitations. So we focus on inequality across commuting zones. We don't have any implications for within group inequality. Automation is going to be modeled as an exogenous shock. Workers are mobile across sectors, but they are not mobile across commuting zones. All goods are tradable, and there's a static model, which means there's no dynamics. So then on to the model. So we start with the sector-specific labor supply. So there we work with a Roy model. What is a Roy model? Well, a Roy model is a model where workers sort into sectors to maximize earnings. And so Raphael's job market paper, I believe, sort of put the Roy model back into the forefront of the trade analysis of distributional effects. So we work with a Roy model. And the earnings on which, so workers sort into sectors to maximize their earnings, and these earnings are going to be a function of workers' effective units of labor ZS and the sector level wage WS per effective unit of labor. Then how are we going to model these distributions of effective units of labor? Well, those are going to be distributed Fréchet. So a worker from group or commuting zone OG is going to have efficiency units ZS in sector S that are drawn IID from a Fréchet distribution with shape parameter kappa and level parameter AOGS. And the role of these parameters is going to become clear in the next few slides. Why do we pick a Fréchet distribution? That's because this extreme value distribution makes the discrete choice setup of sorting into sectors highly tractable. So you sort of get standard logit expressions out of it, which is very convenient to work with. The level parameters, the AOGS, the variation in these level parameters across commuting zones is going to lead to differences in specialization across commuting zones. And these differences in specialization are going to be important because they're going to lead to differential exposure to sector-specific shocks. So sectoral specialization is going to lead to differences in sectoral specialization are going to lead to distributional effects in this setup. So this is what we get out of the Roy Fréchet setup. So the share of workers in group G who choose to work in sector S is given by this pi OGS, these employment shares, which are important. So the higher is AOGS, the level parameter, the more workers select into the sector. The higher is the wage, the more workers select into the sector. And then kappa is going to be the sectoral reallocation elasticity. So the higher is kappa, the more mobile workers are across sectors. And so that's going to be an important parameter as well. The phi OG is also important. This is an index of sectoral wages, where the weights are these level parameters AOGS. So the higher is your AOGS in a given sector, the more you're specialized in that sector, and so the more important the wage in that sector is going to be for your phi OG. So why do I mention this? That's because real labor income per person in a group is going to be a function of this phi OG, of this index of sectoral wages. And that's what we see here. So this is real labor income per person, and that's going to be a function of the employment rate and of the real value of this phi OG. The employment rate is coming from a bare bones search and matching framework. And in addition, we also have the influence of an intensive margin elasticity here, which is coming from a standard labor leisure choice. And so both of these margins here on the intensive and extensive margin are going to follow the model framework of Kim and Vogel's recent AR Insights paper. Okay, so that's the basic setup on the labor supply side. Then on the labor demand side, we have the gravity model of trade. So in particular, we have a multi-sector version of Ethan Kortum, as in Caliendo Paro, which means that the trade shares for destination country D from origin country O are going to have the standard gravity form, where a country's productivity TOS is going to determine how much it's going to export to all the other countries, and that's going to be important for the calibration of the China shock. So that's going to be a change in China's TOS. The trade shares are also a function of the marginal cost here. It's a downward sloping function of the marginal cost. And so this marginal cost is going to be a function of the wage. And that's why we have downward sloping labor demand coming from the labor supply side here. The remaining question then is, what is the share of a sector's revenue that's going to go to labor? And that's what we're going to answer on the next slide. So each sector's production function is going to be a standard Cobb-Douglas production function where we have intermediate goods. So NOKs are intermediate input source from sector K. We use this to model input-output linkages. We have KOS, which are structures. And then in addition, we have the FOS, which is a lower tier CES production function with two inputs, namely efficiency units of labor on the one hand, the ZOS, and equipment or machines on the other hand. And then the elasticity of substitution between labor and machines is going to be this rho parameter. Finally, what we also have here is this XI-OS, which is going to be equipment productivity, which is important for modeling automation in our setup. Technical note is that both structures and equipment are going to be modeled as units of the final good. Okay, then talking more about automation. So the labor compensation share of gross revenue is going to be a function of factor prices and of this equipment productivity XIOS. So it's a function of the wage and the price of the final good and of the equipment productivity. We are going to model automation as an increase in this XIOS in equipment productivity. And when XIOS increases, when there is automation, then this is going to lower the labor compensation share. So workers are going to get a smaller share of the pie when there is an increase in XIOS. Okay, so then we arrive at the labor market equilibrium slide. So putting everything together. So from the Roy-Frischel labor supply side, we have upward sloping supply to each sector. From the trade side, we have downward sloping demand in each sector. Then we can have shocks such as automation, which are going to shift labor demand down. And then finally, the world equilibrium. The equilibrium between supply and demand is going to be a function of the matrix of wages. So then we can perform exact hat algebra to compute the counterfactual equilibria after certain trade or automation shocks. So once we perform this exact hat algebra, we can examine what a group's change in real income is after a given shock. And so that's given by this expression. And we see here that the change in the phi hat and the change in the phi, so the phi hat is very important. And we also notice the importance of the change in the price index, which is capturing the consumer gains. So what we see here is that the distributional effects are driven by a generalized specific factors intuition. Why is that? That's because the wage changes here are going to be weighted by each group's degree of specialization in the sector. So the employment shares, the pi OGS, are very important here for determining how certain wage changes translate into a group's real income. The distributional effects here are going to be largest when labor is a specific factor, so when kappa goes to 1. And they're going to disappear when workers are perfectly mobile. So when workers are perfectly mobile, when kappa goes to infinity, the distributional effects completely disappear. We also notice here certain amplification effects, which are coming from the unemployment, the changes in unemployment, and the adjustments on the intensive margin, which are in line with what is happening in Kim and Vogel. Okay, then on to the empirical and the counterfactual analysis. So the data, so we use data for the period 2000 till 2007. We have 23 sectors with 11 manufacturing sectors. We focus on the US local labor. We focus on the US labor market, where we use data from IPUMS. Trade data is from WIOT. We use data from the socioeconomic accounts to get data on labor compensation share. And then EU CLEMS and OECD data is used to help construct the cost shares. We estimate the important labor supply elasticities. So we have a reallocation elasticity, an intensive margin elasticity, and an employment rate elasticity to estimate. And we find these values. These values are in line with prominent values in the literature. And perhaps more interestingly, to estimate these parameters, we're going to derive structural estimation equations, which we estimate in a transparent and model-based shift share IV approach. And so, unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about that today, but you can check it out in the paper. Then, in addition to these estimated elasticities, we also have a substitution elasticity of labor and equipment that we set to rho equal to 4.24, and we set the trade elasticity to 5. How do we calibrate the shocks? Well, we calibrate them in a relatively simple way in this paper. So we're going to model the China shock as Chinese sector level productivity growth, and we're just going to calibrate the changes in China's productivity such that the model exactly matches increased US imports from China. Then we're going to have equipment-specific productivity growth, the XIOS, which is labor saving. And so we're going to calibrate these XIOS such that the model exactly matches changes in US sectoral labor shares. Importantly, we're going to jointly calibrate these shocks, since the joint impact of trade and automation on the targeted moments is going to be different from their isolated impact. So it's sort of one of the arguments of the paper is that it's important to look at trade and automation jointly. What do we find then? So here we find the results on real income across US commuting zones. In this column, we have the aggregate effects for the 3 different shocks. And here we have the standard deviation of the income gains across commuting zones. What we find is that both the China shock and the automation shock have substantial distributive effects, but the China shock has substantially lower aggregate gains than the automation shock. Interestingly, then, the aggregate gain of the combined shock is going to be larger than the sum of the parts due to the joint calibration. And the distributional effect of the combined shock is going to be larger than that of any individual shock, but smaller than the sum of the parts. So this is coming from the fact that the CZ level shocks are positively correlated, which implies that the impact of the combined shock is larger than any of the individual shocks, but it's smaller than the sum of the parts, which is coming from the imperfect correlation of these CZ level shocks. Here we have a map of the predicted changes in real income of the automation and the China shock. So what we find is that in the Rust Belt in particular, we have sort of strong negative or low income gains. And so as well as east of the Mississippi River and sort of in this Appalachian region here. And so a strong concentration of these low to negative gains there. Perhaps more importantly, we also have a very good model fit of the variation across commuting zones with what we see in the data. So what we do here is we regress the observed changes in groups' income, hourly wage, hours worked, the employment rate, and the change in manufacturing employment. We regress those observed changes on the model's predicted changes, and we find that they're very strongly correlated, as you can see by the R-squared. But then also we match the magnitude of the changes. So what we want here is a coefficient of 1. If the coefficient here is 1, then the model perfectly matches the magnitude of the observed variation in the data. And so typically, once we control for certain standard ADH controls, then we find the coefficient that's insignificantly different from 1. This is the fit for changes in manufacturing value added. So what we see here is the actual change in value added. And so the actual change compared to the change in value added for the models predicted China and automation shock. Okay, 4 minutes left. I'm going to finish a little bit earlier then. So what we find is that for the combined shock, we have an R-squared that's equal to 71%, so relatively high. And what's interesting is that when we look at the combined shock, the sign of the value added changes is also roughly right. So the actual changes in value added are sort of centered around 0. And that's also what we find here in the predicted changes. That's different if we look at the individual shocks. So for the China shock, we have a lower R-squared, but the China shock is also going to predict that there's falling value added for almost all sectors, for all sectors. And so that's not what we see in the data. For automation, that's going to predict rising value added for most sectors. And so that's also not what we see in the data. And so then putting the two shocks together, then you can actually match pretty well what is going on in the actual changes in value added for the manufacturing sectors. So the conclusion, so we develop a model to jointly examine the impact of trade and automation on local labor markets. The combined effect of the China shock and automation over 2000 to 2007 is a 2.92% increase in aggregate real income. There's a standard deviation of 1.09 percentage points. And we also explain the decline of manufacturing employment by 0.96 percentage points. So manufacturing employment falls by roughly 3 percentage points, I think, through this time period. And so we explain about a third of what's going on there. So the other is then due to secular trends, which are not captured by the model. And then the China shock contributes almost as much as automation to the distributional effect of the combined shock, but its impact on the aggregate gain is less than half of automation's impact. What's interesting is that the individual shocks tend to underpredict the variation in the data, whereas the combined shocks fits the data quite well. So thanks a lot for your attention. And yeah, if there's any feedback, I'd love hearing it.
Thank you very much, Simon. Also, very relevant paper. You have a few questions on the chat, and happy to discuss more at the end. Now it's my turn. So I'll need someone to be the police of myself. So Jim, could you chair while I talk? And you can also do the same gestures. Like 5 minutes or, yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thanks a lot, guys. Okay, so this is the final paper. This is joint work with João Paulo Pessoa, Ricardo Reyes Heroles, and Sharon Traberman. So my approach here is going to be a very high-level view of the paper. I'm not going to have time to go through the very details of the model. So I see this as more, okay, what do we do? Why do we do this? And sort of some of the results of the paper. And then it's a teaser for everyone who is interested and see the paper. Okay, so the motivation here is that, there's quite a bit of evidence by now that globalization shocks, such as the rise of China, trade liberalization, lead to disruptions in the labor market. And this empirical literature has encouraged a lot of us to model and quantify the labor market adjustment process in response to these shocks. Okay, and a big chunk of the interest here is that we're interested in measuring and unpacking mobility frictions that workers face in moving across sectors, occupations, or regions. And we're also interested in quantifying the implications of these mobility frictions for the adjustment process in response to globalization shocks, but also for distributional impacts of these shocks. And we have also used some of these frameworks to study smoothing policies that the government could implement to compensate losers. Now, this literature has been silent about the role of trading balances in the adjustment process, right? And meanwhile, what do we see? We see a very persistent trade deficit in the US, and very important policy actors in the country blaming both globalization and these persistent trade deficits for the labor market problems in the country. Now, trade deficits have for decades and across the political spectrum occupied a key role in policymakers' concerns with globalization. Okay, so there are 2 points here that are important. One, which is a bit more an economic perspective, is that there's this concern that trade deficits are actually crowding out domestic production and jobs in sectors that are believed to offer good jobs, such as manufacturing. But also, there's this perception by the public that trade deficits define winners and losers. Okay? And so perhaps in the disconnect with currency, perhaps in the disconnect with current policy and public concerns, trade economists typically ignore changes in imbalances when they study the labor market adjustment process. And here, the question that we ask in this paper is whether, does it matter if we ignore trading balances? And what exactly do we lose by doing so? Now, ex ante, let me give you some intuition of why we think it ought to matter to model trading balances. Okay, so think about a textbook model of trade, balanced trade model, okay, textbook. So in that model, import shocks are export shocks. We need a synchronization between import shocks and export shocks. Okay, so whenever we have Chinese imports coming in the US, think about Chinese imports in textiles. In a balanced trade model, we have a contraction of the textile sector, but that contraction must be synchronized with an export expansion in other sectors, simultaneously absorbing some of these workers. Now, if we don't have trade balance, if we do not impose trade balance and we allow for trading balance that could be persistent over time, then import shocks do not have to be accompanied by export shocks, and we don't have this mechanism allowing for these displaced workers in textiles to be reallocated quickly and swiftly by expanding sectors. Okay, so allowing for trading balances could in principle lead to very serious problems of adjustment, especially in the short to medium run. So what do we do in this paper? We take this view seriously, and we're going to be developing a framework to understand the role of trading balances in the labor market adjustment process in response to globalization shocks. Okay? We're going to be doing so by endogenizing trading balances in a model of international trade with both unemployment and costly labor market adjustment. So more specifically, we build an estimable general equilibrium multi-country, multi-sector model with 3 key ingredients. Okay, so the first building block here is that we're going to have countries around the world making consumption and savings decisions by means of an international bonds market, okay, as suggested by Upsfeld and Rogoff. Okay, so this international bonds market is going to allow countries to save and dissave by running trade surpluses or trade deficits. Okay, and the reason why we have this happening is because countries want to smooth consumption over time in response to shocks. So that's the first building block, and that's how we generate trading balances in this model. The second building block is that we're going to have labor market frictions across and within sectors, and we are going to allow for potentially rich unemployment dynamics. Mobility frictions across sectors are modeled as Arthur Cherry and McLaren, and mobility frictions within sectors, okay, is modeled as Morton and Simpliceriti. So we allow for both unemployment, but also job destruction and job creation. And then third building block is that, you know, the how the world is connected is through a recurring comparative advantage model of trade that is also costly. Okay, so we're going to be building on the Caliendo-Paro model, okay, where we have multiple sectors, but also intersector linkages between them. Now, the paper spends quite a lot of time trying to show how, and in a typical presentation, I spent quite a bit of a time showing how do we fit these three frameworks together. Here, I'm just going to move on. Okay. Okay, so once we develop this model or this framework, we take it to the data. We consider 6 countries, and in particular here, the 6 countries we consider are going to be the US and China, in part because we want to think about the China shock in the context of our model as well. And then the 4 remaining countries are going to be aggregates of countries. We're going to have the Americas, we're going to have Europe, we're going to have Asia and Oceania, as well as the rest of the world sector. We're going to have 6 sectors. Okay, we're going to have agriculture and mining, then low tech, mid tech, and high tech manufacturing, and we're going to have low tech and high tech services. Now we're going to be using data from the World Input-Output Database, information on unemployment from ILO Stat, and a series of labor market flows information from the US CPS. We estimate this model using a method of simulated moments. We assume that year 2000 is in steady state. And what I think is nice about our estimation method is that if we condition on trade flows and trade deficits as observed in 2000, estimation can be done country by country, which greatly simplifies the estimation procedure. And no need to estimate productivity levels and trade cost levels. We're going to rely on hat algebra for some of our counterfactuals. So we're going to be feeding the model with changes in productivity and trade costs, and going to be using hat algebra to obtain the dynamics in response to shocks. So we target a series of moments. Let me emphasize here that in the version of the paper that I'm presenting today, because we only use labor market flows from the CPS, we imposed mobility costs in the US to be common across all countries in the world. However, there's a version which I hope is going to be ready by the end of the year or by January, where we actually bring labor market flows for many countries in the world so that we're able to make a much better job in estimating mobility costs and frictions across countries. Okay, so before I go on, so there's in the paper, we start the simulation part by focusing on impulse response functions to 3 types of shocks. Okay, these shocks are going to be productivity shocks in China, but they're going to have very different time series properties. So here, I think it's very informative that we focus on a temporary shock in productivity in China. So it's going to be a 5-year, 10-fold uniform increase in Chinese productivity across sectors. So China becomes very productive for 5 years, then it goes back to its initial level of productivity. Now in the paper, we also look at, okay, what if China becomes more productive very slowly over time, and then it reaches a plateau and it stays in the plateau forever, right? Which is a bit more, more similar to what we have been experiencing. But also we have a shock where China becomes more productive forever, and it's a once and for all shock that happens with no delay. Okay, but let's first focus on this temporary 5-year shock in productivity in China. So China is very productive for 5 years, and it goes back then to its normal productivity level. That is going to prompt China to be willing to smooth consumption over time. Okay, it's going to be smoothing consumption over time by saving in the short run. Okay, and it's going to be saving by shipping goods abroad. So it's going to be overproducing relative to consumption. So it ships goods abroad. It runs a surplus in the short run. Okay, so in the long run, it's able to overconsume, okay, to smooth consumption. So in the long run, China runs a permanent trade deficit. Now, in the rest of the world, the opposite happens, because the rest of the world is going to be absorbing this excess production in China. And in the rest of the world, every single country runs a trade deficit in the short run, and then a trade surplus in the long run. Let me emphasize here that every single country in this simulation is starting at trade balance. Okay, what are the consequences of this behavior of trading balances over time? So remember again that China is becoming productive temporarily. And as we saw in the previous slide, China overproduces in the short run in order to save, okay, to maintain as nearly as possible level of consumption over time. So China here is going to overproduce and ship these goods by reallocating a lot of resources towards manufacturing. So that's what we see here, is that the manufacturing sectors in China, they grow tremendously in the short run in order to be able to save. And then in the long run, China wants to consume, some of these produced goods, and therefore in the long run, China then contracts its manufacturing sector. Now, what's happening in the US is that the US then in the short run receives some of these goods and downsizes its manufacturing sector because it's faced with very stiff import competition from China. So the US is consuming a lot more manufacturing, and because of homothetic preferences in this framework, it shifts labor to services in order to consume more of both services and manufacturing. Okay, so we have in the short run a decline in manufacturing in the US, a reallocation of resources to services. Okay, but in the long run, the US will have to repay some of these goods to China. So in the long run, it will have to undo this reallocation. Okay, so in the long run, the US expands its manufacturing sector and downsizes its service sector. Okay, in the long run, if you remember the previous slide, in the long run, the US will have to run a trade surplus in order to pay for these goods in the short run. But what is interesting here is that we have this non-monotonic pattern of reallocations, right? So in the US contracts sharply in manufacturing in the short run, and then in the long run, it sort of expands. This is not something we see if we had imposed trade balance in this model. If we had imposed trade balance, then the pattern of reallocation is purely dictated by comparative advantage motives. There's no consumption savings. There's no consumption smoothing playing a role here. Okay, and you see here the magnitude of reallocation is much more muted than under our complete model. So this is one interesting thing to notice. The other interesting thing to notice is that if we have a trade balance model, because it's a temporary shock, there's no long run effects on allocations in the long run. However, in our complete model with trading balances, because we have these persistence trade surpluses and because we have these trade surpluses and deficits across countries, we do have very persistent effects across sectors and countries, okay? Even though the shock is temporary. Now, this leads to the fact that our model leads, if we compare reallocation across the model with trading balances and the model with balanced trade, we have an order of magnitude larger reallocation in our full model as opposed to the balanced trade model, right? Precisely because you have these non-monotonic patterns of reallocation. That in turn leads to much larger unemployment responses if we consider trading balances. Okay, because we have a lot more reallocation, we also have a lot more job creation and job destruction, so that jobs is destroyed, people go to unemployment, and then there's congestion in the sectors where they want to go, and that leads to much larger unemployment responses as well. Now, what is interesting here is that we don't find any systematic relationship between the sign of imbalances, whether you're running trade deficits or surpluses, and whether countries are running or going through increases in unemployment. Okay, so changes in unemployment are not systematically related to the sign of imbalances. Now, one result that we got from these impulse response functions is, again, we run several of these impulse response functions in the paper, and we make a convincing case that it's not only the initial and final level of the shocks, but the full path of shocks matters for where the economy is going to end up in the long run. So we really need to discipline shocks carefully if you want to think about things like the China shock, or if you want to think about the impact of globalization shocks on the adjustment process in different countries. So we actually use our model to invert changes in trade costs, changes in productivities, as well as changes in preferences across countries. So you can think about these phi hat shocks here as a way that our model has to generate the savings glut, especially in China, over the course of the 2000s. Okay, but basically here, we go through a shock extraction process in order to be able to conduct more realistic counterfactuals. One interesting thing that we find here, and let's focus just on the first line, is that we look at the consumption gains of globalization over the course of the 2000s. Okay, so, and we do this by doing the following. Suppose that the US had, there were no shocks in the US at all. The US had constant productivity, constant trade shocks with the rest of the world. And then we just shock the rest of the world. We shock productivity around the rest of the world, trade costs. And then we ask the question, how much did the US benefit from just globalization shocks? So if our complete model, we find that welfare in the US measured by consumption, we find that consumption in the US goes up by 2.2% over the 15 years we consider. Now, these gains would have been larger if China did not go through this very large savings glut. Okay, so the savings glut in China did hurt welfare in the US. However, if we had the US running balanced trade every period, then welfare gains would have been much smaller. Okay. Now, I think I'm out of time here. Let me just say that we also use our model to compare how do our model compares with ACR formula for the welfare gains. And the only thing I can say here is that, I mean, there are many reasons to believe that our model are going to be leading to very different gains as ACR, because, we have trading balances, which ACR do not allow for. At least they don't allow for endogenous trading balances, but also they don't allow for trade for labor market frictions. So let me skip this. I'm sorry I have to run. But what are the takeaways from our paper, we think? I mean, one is that imbalances can greatly magnify the effects of globalization on intersectoral reallocation and unemployment. Importantly, and speaking to policy concerns, we don't find that changes in employment are systematically related to the sign of imbalances. Okay. Two, I glossed over this, but we find that the gains from trade are very often of different sign of magnitude compared to the benchmark ACR formula. We find that globalization gains accrued an increase in 2.2% in welfare in the US. These gains would have been 73% larger in the absence of the global savings glut, but they would have been 40% smaller in a balanced trade world. We also use the paper to think about the China shock. I didn't talk about this here. I did just mention one conclusion. We do find that the China shock accounts for a sizable fraction of total sectoral relocation in the US, but we actually find near zero impact of the China shock on unemployment and very small impacts on consumption. Okay, thank you all very much. And I think we can now open the floor for discussion. Yeah, unmute yourselves.
So I'm just going to ask what I wrote on the chat.
Okay.
So in the graph where you were comparing the results of including the trade imbalances versus the ACR benchmark, I see that the results for the US and China even flipped.
Yes.
But it seems that for the other regions, the results didn't change as much. Is this a feature of the assumptions that you're making for the US, or is it like something other than that?
I mean, so assumptions we're making in the US, I mean, yeah, so in this particular version, we're imposing US costs to be the same, right? I mean, rest of the world costs of moving across sectors the same as the US. Now, in the new version that we don't do this. I mean, we estimate the mobility costs for each country by bringing, flows data from other countries. But actually, we find even starker. We're finding even starker differences. I mean, we have to better understand what exactly is driving these differences. But I think the short answer to your question, no. I mean, even if you allow for different frictions, we still have very large discrepancies between the ACR formula and our model. So I think I'm gonna ask the questions to Jim as well. I see here that so let me open that to the public. Daniela had questions for Jim. Do you want to ask them in person, Daniela?
Hi, yes, I can do that. Thank you so much for a great session. This was really cool. I just had two questions for Jim. I'm sorry that I asked him a little bit late, but the first question that I asked in the chat is, I'm a little bit confused of why training is lower for, is kind of interrupted for the lower skilled workers when the kind of mid-skill occupation part is hollowed out. Because you would think that if job-to-job transitions, decrease, it would be more likely that firms would want to train those workers, right? Because they're kind of shielded from, competition, from them going to like other places where they can use that training. So I just wonder if this result is coming solely from the kind of like, transitions to non-employment or to unemployment. So that's my first question, if that's like what's doing all the lifting here. And the second question that I have is that, and maybe I'm misunderstanding something here, but you would think that, in kind of climbing the job ladder, there would be a relative substitutability between training and going to college, in the sense that either can help you climb the ladder. So I would have thought that in the context of the model, college workers will have less training, but that's the opposite from the data. So I just wonder if this is coming in the model just from the ability heterogeneity, or if there's something else happening here that I'm missing. Thanks, sorry. Those were my two questions.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Those are good points that I should have addressed more in my talk. There's two things going on with the training among low skilled workers. One is that they tend to end up in service jobs where the return to training is very low. The return from having more skill differs across sectors. And if that's where they get bumped, then there's less incentive. The other thing that's going on is the prices of these different types of labor services adjust. And when it comes down for the low skill occupations, that also reduces the amount of surplus you generate with training. So those things are both in the context of model dampening training. On your second question, it's true that there is some substitutability, but those are really two separate tracks in the model. There's kind of a college track and a non-college track. And if you go to college, then you end up not dealing with any of the lower rungs, and you get into occupations where the return to training is higher, partly because the value of those services is higher. So holding job turnover rates constant, that you just get more incentive to train those workers up. So I don't know if that addresses. I don't know.
No, yes, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Thank you.
I had a question for you, Rafael. So is there any scope for using your model to analyze exchange rate issues, exchange rate policy issues? In other words, switching from a fixed regime to a float, or you need some kind of shock in there in order to have that be a relevant question. Right?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm not as well versed in international macro as you can guess. I mean, I think it's a good question. I think this is something we should definitely be thinking about in the future. My understanding here is that, I mean, from my little knowledge of exchange rates and monetary policies, that you would need a role for the monetary policy for exchange rates to have a meaningful impact on the economy. Is that do you share that view?
Yeah, I'm at least as ill prepared to answer that question as you. But yeah, that sounds right.
But I think I think it's definitely an interesting a question to address, because you can think about, artificial, right, exchange rate regimes as drivers of trade surpluses or deficits, at least in the short run.
Right. I mean, the China exchange rate regime was what brought it to mind.
Now, the way this is coming out in our model is a bit ad hoc, or not necessarily ad hoc, but outside of the model. I mean, it's coming as a residual, because for us to be able to match the large surplus that China is going through in the past few years, we need what we call the preference shocks. We need these intertemporal preference shocks. We need China to be extremely patient and be willing to save a lot in the short run to be overcoming consumption motives, the consumption smoothing motives that our model has, right? So China is becoming very, very productive. So our model, without any intertemporal preference shocks, would be predicting that China would have to be, conducting deficits in the short run and not surpluses. So the way we fix this is by adding these unmodeled shocks to preferences. No, but one thing. So before I ask you a question, I mean, one thing that we're thinking about doing, maybe in a separate paper, is to think about the role of tariffs in getting close to trade balance, and how would that affect adjustment. But also we were thinking about doing this with two types of workers as well, like skilled and unskilled. Now, back to your paper, Jim. I had this question. I missed exactly how automation is coming into your model. So I didn't really see the production function.
Yeah, sorry. It's very much Acemoglu Restrepo. It's just showing up in the exponents in the Cobb-Douglas aggregation of the occupations. So if those are going down, then it's being displaced by, those occupations are being displaced by machines. And if they're not going down, they're not. So it's pretty primitive. And
are these perfect substitutes or imperfect substitutes?
Well, I mean, in the Acemoglu Restrepo setting, production involves a continuum of tasks, and some of the tasks are automated, but that doesn't mean that you've completely eliminated the need for labor. In that sense, it's not a perfect substitute. Okay. I don't know, that's a one-sentence answer. But we've got a lot of work to do still on getting it into the model in a convincing way. I asked Simon about the way he was handling it, because one thing that comes up when we're letting automation happen in different countries is you could have a big labor share either because you had a lot of innovation that created jobs for workers, or you could have or you could be really inefficient in the sense that you haven't automated when you should have. So you've got to take a stand on that. And I think in our model, it amounts to just choosing a country which is perfect, maybe Germany or something, and if you've got less automation than Germany, that's because you didn't adopt enough robots. If you have more, it's because you haven't adopted robots yet. But it's pretty crude. I was interested to see that Simon had actually calibrated the productivity of capital there. I'll have to think about that.
So our calibration of the automation shock is also quite crude. We're just matching the changes in the labor share in the United States manufacturing sectors. And so if that labor share is going up, then we interpret that as automation at the moment. If it's going down, then if the labor share is going up, then if the labor share is going down, then we interpret that as automation, and the other way around. And so there's more to do there in terms of thinking about like separating what is happening to productivity of workers, and also like we do have a robustness check where we sort of benchmark, or where we, instead of focusing on labor shares in the United States, we look at labor share changes in a broad set of countries, and then we sort of, similar to what you were saying about Germany, so we're sort of thinking, oh, there's sort of a common technological change in all these countries, and then for that robustness check, we sort of find similar results. I'm not sure if that answers your question, or can I ask a question to Jose? So I'm kind of, I mean, this is related to questions that you've gotten before at other venues, but about monetary policy. So at the moment you find very strong welfare effects from the China shock, and often negative. And so in principle, if you have enough nominal growth, you can undo these negative employment effects. And so I'm sort of wondering if the results that you're finding are perhaps consistent with some kind of Taylor rule, where there's a trade-off between unemployment changes and inflation, and so, or how you're thinking about that.
So we have thought a lot about it. So right now, what our model is saying is that it must be some sort of monetary